The Venezuela bombing wasn't really about Venezuela. This will sound counterintuitive when American bombs fell on Venezuelan territory, when the official statements frame it as action against Maduro's regime, when the immediate aftermath focuses on Venezuelan politics and regional responses. But understanding what's actually happening requires looking past the stated justifications to the strategic logic underneath. Venezuela is the stage, not the play. The bombing sends messages that have nothing to do with Caracas and everything to do with Beijing, Moscow, and the future of global economic architecture. This is about demonstrating that America will use military force to prevent the erosion of dollar dominance, to signal costs for countries that align with China and Russia, and to assert that resource-rich nations can't escape American influence regardless of which great powers they partner with. Venezuela is the example. The lesson is for everyone else watching. Understanding the real targets of the bombing requires examining what Venezuela represents in broader geopolitical competition, why this moment was chosen for military action, and what messages are being sent to audiences far beyond Latin America. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, over 300 billion barrels. But it's not the quantity that matters most strategically. It's how that oil relates to the global economic architecture that America has dominated since World War II. For decades, Venezuelan oil was sold in dollars, refined in American facilities, and integrated into hemispheric energy markets where the United States was the dominant buyer and influence. This created relationships where Venezuela's economic interests aligned with American preferences even when political relationships were hostile. That entire architecture has collapsed over the past decade. Venezuela now sells oil primarily to China, denominated in yuan rather than dollars. Chinese companies have invested heavily in Venezuelan oil infrastructure, locking in long-term supply relationships that bypass American markets entirely. Russian companies facilitate Venezuelan oil exports through sanctions evasion networks. The oil still flows, but it flows east rather than north. It's priced in yuan rather than dollars, and it creates dependencies on Beijing and Moscow rather than Washington. This matters because oil trades denominated in currencies other than dollars threaten the foundation of American global power. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency and the medium for commodity trades provides enormous advantages. It allows America to run persistent trade deficits because foreign countries need dollars to buy oil and other commodities. It gives American financial sanctions devastating power because dollar exclusion means exclusion from global trade. It allows America to finance government spending at lower costs because global dollar demand keeps interest rates lower than domestic fundamentals would justify. The petrodollar system specifically, where oil trades globally in dollars, has been central to dollar dominance since the 1970s, when Saudi Arabia and other major producers agreed to price oil in dollars. This created structural demand for dollars that sustained American economic position, even as manufacturing declined and trade deficits expanded. Every country that needs to buy oil needs to acquire dollars. This creates the Treasury bond market that finances American government. It creates the dollar liquidity that makes American financial markets central to global capital flows. It creates the leverage that makes American sanctions effective. The system's origins reveal its strategic importance. After Nixon ended dollar-gold convertibility in 1971, the dollar needed alternative anchoring. The 1973 oil crisis provided the opportunity. Henry Kissinger negotiated agreements with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf producers. They would price oil exclusively in dollars and invest their surplus revenues in U.S. Treasury bonds. In exchange, America would provide security guarantees, weapons sales, and political support for Gulf monarchies. This arrangement created self-reinforcing dynamics. Oil importing countries needed dollars to buy energy, creating constant demand for dollars regardless of America's trade balance. Oil exporters accumulated dollars from sales and invested them in U.S. treasuries, financing American deficits at low interest rates. The recycling of petrodollars through treasury markets allowed America to run persistent current account deficits while maintaining reserve currency status. This was the foundation of American economic dominance for 50 years. Venezuela selling oil to China in yuan attacks this architecture directly. Each barrel sold in yuan rather than dollars is one less transaction, creating dollar demand. When China accumulates yuan from oil purchases, it can use those yuan for other trades, creating an alternative currency network that doesn't depend on dollar centrality. When Russian, Iranian, and other sanctioned producers also sell in yuan, the alternative network expands. The threat isn't one country's oil sales, it's the demonstration that alternatives to the petrodollar system can function and potentially grow. The bombing sends a message about costs of de-dollarization. Venezuela tried to escape dollar dependency by selling to China in yuan. Now, American bombs fall. The message to other oil producers is explicit. Moving away from dollar-denominated trade brings military consequences. This isn't stated in official justifications. Those focus on democracy and human rights. But the strategic logic underneath is about defending the economic architecture that sustains American power. Consider the timing. Venezuela has been selling oil to China for years. Maduro has been in power since 2013. The humanitarian crisis has been severe for a decade. Regional stability has been compromised by refugee flows for years. None of these factors changed recently in ways that would explain bombing now rather than 2 years ago or 2 years from now. What changed is the acceleration of de-dollarization globally and the expansion of yuan-based trade systems that threaten dollar centrality. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, have been actively developing alternatives to dollar-based trade and payment systems. The new development bank finances projects in local currencies. Bilateral trade increasingly uses national currencies rather than dollars. China and Russia conduct the majority of their trade in yuan and rubles. India purchases Russian oil in rupees. The systems are incomplete and face significant technical challenges, but they're growing and demonstrating that alternatives to dollar dominance are possible. More significantly, the expansion of BRICS Plus to include countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, and Egypt brings major energy producers into a bloc explicitly focused on reducing dollar dependence. Saudi Arabia, the anchor of the petrodollar system since the 1970s, is conducting some trade with China in yuan. UAE is developing yuan clearing systems. Iran, locked out of dollar markets by sanctions, uses yuan for oil sales. The petrodollar system isn't collapsing immediately, but the foundations are eroding as major producers diversify currency exposure. The 2024 BRICS expansion was the most significant challenge to American economic architecture since Bretton Woods. Adding Saudi Arabia, the country whose dollar commitment created the petrodollar system, signals potential transformation. Saudi Arabia hasn't abandoned dollar pricing entirely, but it's exploring alternatives. The Saudi-Chinese agreements to accept yuan for some oil purchases, Saudi investment in Chinese refineries, and Saudi participation in yuan clearing systems all indicate strategic hedging away from exclusive dollar dependence. UAE's role is equally significant. As a major financial hub, UAE developing yuan clearing capabilities creates infrastructure that enables Gulf China trade without dollar intermediation. Abu Dhabi's agreements with Chinese banks to settle trades in yuan, the establishment of yuan liquidity pools in UAE financial centers, and Emirati investment in Chinese currency markets all build the plumbing that makes de-dollarization functional rather than theoretical. Iran's complete exclusion from dollar systems through sanctions made it the laboratory for yuan-based trade. Iranian oil exports to China denominated in yuan demonstrated that major energy trade could function without dollars. The systems Iran developed to evade dollar-based sanctions, yuan clearing, barter arrangements, cryptocurrency settlements, provide templates for other countries considering how to operate outside dollar systems. Egypt joining BRICS Plus matters because it controls the Suez Canal through which much of Asia-Europe trade flows. Egyptian interest in non-dollar trade settlement, particularly for canal transit fees, could redirect significant payment flows away from dollars. This hasn't happened yet, But Egyptian participation in BRICS Plus institutions signals openness to alternatives. The timing of the Venezuela bombing correlates with this acceleration of de-dollarization. It's not coincidence. The bombing demonstrates that America will use military force when economic architecture is threatened. Venezuela is vulnerable, a relatively weak country without powerful allies that can deter American military action. But the lesson isn't for Venezuela. It's for Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other countries considering Yuan trade. The message is, look what happens to countries that abandon the dollar system. Consider whether diversifying currency exposure is worth potential military consequences. This explains why the bombing targets Venezuela specifically rather than other countries also engaged in de-dollarization. Russia and China are too powerful for direct military confrontation. Iran is nuclear threshold, and any attack risks regional war. Saudi Arabia and UAE are formal allies despite currency diversification. Venezuela is vulnerable enough to attack without risking major war, while visible enough that attacking it sends messages everyone receives. It's the perfect target for demonstrative violence. The Chinese response to the bombing reveals that Beijing understands the real target. Chinese official statements didn't just condemn the attack on Venezuela, they explicitly connected it to American efforts to maintain unipolar hegemony and prevent the emergence of multipolar economic systems. Chinese media emphasized that America attacks countries that seek economic independence from Western systems. The message was clear. This attack was about preventing alternatives to American economic dominance, and China will support countries facing American pressure for pursuing those alternatives. Chinese actions match the rhetoric. Immediately after the bombing, China announced expanded credit lines for Venezuela, increased commitments to oil purchases, and offers of economic support for other Latin American nations interested in diversifying trade relationships. This wasn't humanitarian aid, it was strategic positioning. China is using the bombing to demonstrate that it provides reliable partnership for countries that America punishes for seeking alternatives. Every dollar of Chinese support to Venezuela signals to other countries that abandoning dollar dependence brings Chinese backing. Russia's response followed similar logic. Russian statements condemned American aggression and offered Venezuela military cooperation and security support. But the deeper message was about validation. Russia has faced American sanctions for years, adapted through de-dollarization and partnership with China, and survived. Now, America bombs Venezuela for pursuing similar strategies. Russia's response signals that it will support other countries facing American pressure for the same reasons Russia faces pressure. This builds the alternative bloc that both Russia and China benefit from. The real audience for these messages isn't Venezuela. It's every country watching and calculating whether to maintain dollar dependency or diversify. The calculation has changed. Before the bombing, diversifying currency exposure seemed like a relatively safe economic decision with benefits of reduced vulnerability to American sanctions and financial leverage. After the bombing, that calculation includes potential military consequences, but it also includes visible Chinese and Russian support for countries that face American pressure. The strategic competition underneath all of this is about whether the global economy remains organized around American-dominated institutions and dollar-denominated trade, or whether it fragments into regional systems with multiple reserve currencies and reduced American centrality. This competition has been developing for 2 decades, but has accelerated dramatically in the past 5 years. The American position is that dollar centrality benefits global economic stability. A single reserve currency reduces transaction costs, provides liquidity for global trade, and creates the deep financial markets necessary for efficient capital allocation. Challenging dollar dominance risks fragmenting the global economy into competing currency blocks that would be less efficient and potentially more conflict-prone. Therefore, maintaining dollar centrality serves not just American interests but global economic welfare. The Chinese counter-argument is that dollar dominance gives America unilateral power to sanction countries, freeze assets, and exclude nations from global trade for political reasons. This weaponization of economic interdependence makes dollar dependency a security vulnerability. Countries need alternatives to protect sovereignty and economic security. Multipolarity in currency systems, like multipolarity in political systems, prevents any single power from dominating. This serves not just Chinese interests, but creates a more equitable global economic architecture. Both positions have merit and internal contradictions. Dollar dominance does provide benefits in liquidity and transaction efficiency, but it also gives America enormous power that it uses for political purposes. Multipolar currency systems would reduce American leverage, but also create coordination challenges and potential instability during transitions. The debate isn't primarily about which system is abstractly superior. It's about whose interests are served. The Venezuela bombing represents America's answer to this competition. Military force will be used to prevent erosion of the dollar-based system. This is enormously significant because it makes explicit what was previously implicit. Countries knew that abandoning dollar systems risked American economic retaliation through sanctions. Now they know it risks military attack. The escalation from economic to military enforcement of dollar dominance changes the nature of the competition. But this escalation may backfire for the same reasons sanctions backfire. When America uses military force to prevent countries from diversifying away from dollar dependency, it validates exactly the security concerns that drive diversification. If abandoning the dollar brings bombing, then dollar dependency is even more dangerous than countries feared because it means accepting permanent vulnerability to American political decisions backed by military threats. The bombing intended to deter de-dollarization may accelerate it by proving that dollar dependency is a security threat. The response from Global South nations suggests this backfire is already beginning. Rather than intimidating countries into maintaining dollar ties, the bombing has produced statements emphasizing sovereignty, condemning military enforcement of economic systems, and calling for accelerated development of alternative payment systems. Brazil, India, South Africa, Indonesia, and other major emerging economies have all issued statements that frame the bombing as confirmation that multipolarity is necessary to prevent American unilateral action. The bombing intended to defend dollar dominance is being used to justify exactly the multipolar currency systems that threaten that dominance. The oil dimension adds another layer because energy security drives many countries' strategic calculations. The West has weaponized energy supplies through sanctions on Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. These sanctions intended to pressure governments, but also disrupted global energy markets and created price volatility that harmed countries dependent on energy imports. This demonstrated that energy security requires diversification, not just of suppliers, but of the currency and payment systems that enable energy trade. China's response has been to build alternative energy trading systems denominated in Yuan. The Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange allows oil and gas trading in Yuan with contracts that can be settled without dollars. Countries can buy energy from Russia, Iran, and Venezuela using Yuan without exposing themselves to dollar-based sanctions. This creates an alternative architecture that reduces American leverage over energy trade. The Shanghai International Energy Exchange, INE, launched yuan-denominated crude oil futures in 2018, a direct challenge to dollar-based benchmarks like Brent and WTI. The contracts are settled in yuan but convertible to gold, providing a commodity backing that addresses concerns about yuan currency risk. Daily trading volumes have grown from negligible to over 200,000 contracts, representing significant alternative pricing mechanisms. The system works through several mechanisms. Chinese refiners can purchase oil from sanctioned suppliers like Iran and Venezuela using yuan, avoiding dollar transaction exposure. Sellers receive yuan that can be converted to gold at Shanghai Gold Exchange, providing a store of value without holding Chinese currency. The entire transaction bypasses dollar clearing systems, SWIFT messaging, and American financial oversight. Russia integration into this system accelerated after 2022 sanctions. Russian oil sold to China and India increasingly uses Yuan settlement. The Power of Siberia natural gas pipeline to China operates on Yuan ruble settlement. Russian commodity exports, metals, grain, fertilizer, increasingly trade in non-dollar currencies. The bilateral trade exceeding $200 billion annually happens largely outside dollar systems. The bombing doesn't stop this architecture from developing. It accelerates it by demonstrating why it's needed. Countries watching the Venezuela bombing and calculating their energy security strategies now have concrete evidence that energy trade in dollars creates vulnerability to American military action against suppliers. Diversifying to yuan-based systems looks more attractive when the alternative is exposure to supply disruptions from American military intervention. The technology dimension matters because the competition over global economic architecture increasingly involves digital infrastructure. China's development of digital yuan, its expansion of payment systems like Alipay and WeChat Pay, and its construction of alternative SWIFT-like systems for international transactions all create infrastructure that enables de-dollarization. The more countries use Chinese digital payment infrastructure, the easier it becomes to conduct trade without dollars. The bombing doesn't damage this infrastructure. It provides marketing for why countries need it. Chinese messaging post-bombing emphasizes that countries using Chinese payment systems can't be excluded from global trade by American financial sanctions. This is true, and the bombing reinforces the message by demonstrating that America will go to extreme lengths to maintain financial leverage. Every country considering whether to integrate with Chinese payment systems now has the Venezuela bombing as evidence of why maintaining dollar dependency is risky. The institutional dimension reveals the deepest strategic competition. The Bretton Woods institutions, IMF, World Bank, and the broader dollar-based financial architecture have governed global economics since 1944. American dominance of these institutions gave Washington enormous influence over global economic policy. The institutions provided stability, but also enforced Washington consensus policies that served American interests. China and Russia have been building alternative institutions explicitly designed to reduce this American dominance. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank finances development without IMF conditionality. The new development bank provides alternatives to World Bank lending. The Belt and Road Initiative creates economic integration that doesn't depend on Western institutional approval. These institutions are far smaller than Bretton Woods architecture, but they're growing and demonstrating that alternatives exist. The bombing sends a message about the costs of using alternative institutions. Venezuela has borrowed from Chinese banks, participated in Belt and Road, and reduced its engagement with IMF and World Bank. Now, it faces bombing. The message is, abandoning Western institutions brings military consequences. But again, this may backfire by validating the security logic that makes countries want alternatives. If using Western institutions means accepting American political control backed by military force, then the institutions themselves become security threats that countries need to escape. The middle power response will determine whether the bombing achieves its strategic goals or backfires catastrophically. Countries like Brazil, India, Indonesia, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia are large enough to matter economically, but not powerful enough to resist American pressure through military deterrence. They're exactly the countries whose choices about dollar dependency and institutional alignment will determine whether American economic dominance erodes or persists. Before the bombing, these countries were cautiously exploring alternatives to dollar systems while maintaining dollar relationships. They were hedging, developing capabilities to operate in yuan or other currencies while continuing most trade in dollars. This was rational risk management that allowed them to reduce vulnerability to American sanctions without fully committing to alternatives that might not succeed. After the bombing, the calculation changes. Hedging looks more necessary because dollar dependency brings military risk, but it also looks more dangerous because America has demonstrated willingness to bomb countries that diversify. The middle powers face difficult choices, maintain dollar dependency, and accept vulnerability to American political decisions backed by military force, or diversify and risk becoming bombing targets, or try to hedge carefully enough to reduce vulnerability without triggering American military response. Early indications suggest most middle powers are choosing accelerated hedging rather than retreat to dollar dependency. Brazil announced expanded Yuan trade immediately after the bombing. India emphasized sovereignty in currency decisions. Saudi Arabia reaffirmed plans to diversify oil sales currencies. The pattern suggests the bombing didn't intimidate countries into dollar dependency. It convinced them that diversification is more urgent because American willingness to use military force is now explicit. This brings us back to Venezuela. The country is devastated. Bombs fell. Maduro strengthened politically, and the humanitarian situation worsened. But from the perspective of the strategic competition over global economic architecture, Venezuela's immediate situation is almost irrelevant. What matters is whether the bombing deters other countries from de-dollarization or accelerates it by validating security concerns. Based on initial responses, the bombing appears to be backfiring strategically while succeeding tactically. Tactically, American bombs hit targets and demonstrated military capability. Strategically, the bombing validated exactly the security logic that drives countries to seek alternatives to dollar dependency, provided China and Russia with opportunities to demonstrate alternative partnerships, and accelerated discussions about multipolar currency systems. The Venezuela bombing wasn't about Venezuela. It was about defending dollar dominance by demonstrating military consequences for de-dollarization. It was about sending messages to Beijing, Moscow, Riyadh, and Brasilia about costs of abandoning American-dominated economic architecture. It was about reasserting American centrality to global economic systems through violence when those systems are threatened by alternatives. Whether it worked depends on whether countries respond by retreating to dollar dependency out of fear or by accelerating diversification, because the bombing proved that dollar dependency creates exactly the security vulnerability that makes alternatives necessary. The evidence suggests the latter. The bombing intended to defend American economic dominance may have accelerated its erosion by making explicit the military force underlying that dominance and validating the concerns that drive countries to seek alternatives. This wasn't about Venezuela, and the consequences won't be confined to Venezuela either.